Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Today, we are doing a deep dive into Dr. Tiberius Rata's fascinating lecture on how the biblical theme of restoration weaves its way through history. If you've ever felt bogged down reading the Old Testament prophets, this analysis is going to completely change how you view those ancient texts. We're looking at the grand narrative of God as a restorer, and as you'll see, the story is much bigger and much more unfinished than you might think.
Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to hit the prophetic cycle, look at promises across the centuries, dive into the historical return to Jerusalem, talk about leadership, and then wrap up with why this restoration is actually still unfinished and waiting for its ultimate fulfillment. Let's get right into it.
All right, part one, the prophetic cycle. You know, reading the Old Testament prophets can honestly feel a bit repetitive sometimes, right? Almost like a broken record. But Dr. Rata points out there's actually a very specific three-step rhythm happening here. First, the people fall into sin. Then comes step two, judgment. Think of the massive Assyrian and Babylonian exiles where people were literally ripped from their homeland. But here's the kicker. You got to read to the end of the script. Because the final, absolutely crucial third step, it is always restoration.
Now, what do we actually mean by restoration? In plain English, it just means fixing something up or bringing it back to normal. But biblical restoration? It is so much deeper than that. It's not just hitting the undo button. It's this massive, absolute renewal of the fortunes of God's people after experiencing the sheer devastation of exile. We're talking about a complete promise to rebuild from the ground up.
Moving on to Section 2, let's look at how these promises echo across the centuries.
We literally see this promise pop up in every single era of biblical history. Whether it's Joel's early promises or 8th century prophets like Amos and Isaiah, the core message is amazingly consistent. They're all promising this fruitful, complete rebuilding for a faithful remnant. Amos is out there talking about planting fresh vineyards and drinking wine from ruined cities brought back to life. Isaiah is talking about raising up the tribes of Jacob. The main takeaway here, judgment was never, ever the final word.
Then, by the 7th and 6th centuries, things get highly specific. Take the prophet Jeremiah. He actually witnessed the terrifying destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BC. But he doesn't just predict the exile, he gives it a literal expiration date, 70 years. And what's wild is that right in the middle of all this impending doom, he delivers what's called the Book of Comfort. It explicitly guarantees a new covenant, promising the people that they will, without a doubt, one day buy fields, sign deeds, and thrive in their homeland once again.
Which brings us to Section 3, the actual historical return.
Just as God warned, the judgment phase was brutal. There were three crushing waves of deportation into Babylon. First in 605 BC, then another hit in 597 BC, and finally, the devastating blow in 587 BC. The people were just entirely stripped from their land.
But here is where you really see God's timeline perfectly mirrored. Answering those three deportations were three specific returns. The first wave was led by Zerubbabel, bringing around 50,000 Jews back home. The second was led by Ezra with about 2,000 Israelites, and the third wave was under Nehemiah. It's like a giant puzzle fitting perfectly together. The God who promised the exile completely orchestrated the return.
That leads right into Section 4, focusing on the leadership and the heavy opposition during this time.
When you read the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, you're getting a real-time, on-the-ground look at this restoration. And what you see is basically a dynamic duo of leadership. Ezra was the deeply spiritual teacher of the law. He was totally focused on the theological grounding of the people. Nehemiah, on the other hand, he was the political governor, the action taker. Yes, he was a man of intense prayer, but he was also the guy telling his workers to build the wall with a tool in one hand and a sword in the other to fight off attackers.
This dynamic is captured perfectly in a quote from Dr. Rata's lecture, "Piety is no substitute for preparation, and neither is preparation a substitute for piety." True biblical restoration absolutely required both. You needed Ezra's spiritual devotion, for sure, but you also needed Nehemiah's brilliant tactical planning. You know, you have to pray, but sometimes you also have to get off your knees and get to work.
And boy, did that work pay off. The number 52 here, that represents a literal miracle. Despite constant, intense opposition from regional enemies like Sanballat and Tobiah, Nehemiah and the people rebuilt the entire defensive wall of Jerusalem in just 52 days. The source material points out that even the unbelieving nations around them were terrified because they realized that kind of impossible speed was only happening with God's help.
All right, Section 5, an unfinished restoration.
So they were physically back in the land, they had their wall, they had a temple, but did they live happily ever after? Was the glorious, world-altering restoration promised by those ancient prophets fully accomplished right then and there under Nehemiah?
To answer that, we actually have to fast forward centuries later into the New Testament. In Luke chapter 4, Jesus stands up in the synagogue and reads a super famous prophecy from Isaiah 61. By quoting this specific text about releasing captives and rebuilding ruined cities, Jesus drops a massive hint. He's telling us that the restorative work promised by the prophets wasn't actually finished back in Nehemiah's day.
In fact, scholars like N.T. Wright point out a really fascinating reality. Even though the Jews physically returned from Babylon centuries earlier, they were still under foreign control, first the Greeks, then the Romans. On top of that, the glorious visible presence of God hadn't returned to Zion in the way the prophets described, so spiritually speaking, the nation was actually still in a prolonged state of exile. They were waiting for an ultimate redemption, which the Apostle Paul points to in Romans 11 as a future, massive salvation event.
Which finally brings us to section 6, the ultimate fulfillment.
Think about the symbolic actions of Jesus. When he actively appoints 12 disciples and says they're going to sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel, he isn't just pulling a random number out of thin air. He is actively signaling a direct continuity with those Old Testament prophets. He is symbolizing the ultimate reconstitution, the total gathering of God's people.
And he takes it even further by explicitly borrowing the apocalyptic language of the post-exilic prophet Zechariah. In Mark 13, Jesus talks about the Son of Man coming in the clouds and sending angels to gather his elect from the four winds. That is a direct, unmistakable callback to Zechariah's prophecy about gathering God's people. Basically, Jesus understood his own ministry as the beginning of the end of Israel's long exile.
So here's the huge takeaway from Dr. Rata's lecture. It's this already but not yet theology. God's promise of restoration happens in phases. You had the immediate historical phase where they physically rebuilt the walls under Ezra and Nehemiah. Then you have the Christ phase, initiated during Jesus' first coming to heal the brokenhearted. But it still awaits an ultimate completion when Christ returns to finally make all things new.
As we step back and look at this massive, sweeping timeline of history, it really leaves us with one incredibly powerful thought. If the ultimate restoration of the world is a guaranteed promise that is still unfolding right now, where do you fit into this story? Like Nehemiah, what walls are you building and what part are you playing in the not yet today? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.